your on the lake, your national forest on either side of you. I was pleasantly surprised to learn that the Three Lakes chain actually has 28 lakes, as I'm sure all you know, and is considered the largest chain of freshwater lakes in the world. I did not know that. Freshwater lakes are such an important treasure for all of us. And really, for me, I kind of feel like I'm at home because I was raised in the northwest corner of the state and was always able to get out to the lakes and forests quite easily. And so it's very familiar to me. Although I've never presented in a theater before, so this is really great. And thanks to Paul for getting all this great equipment running here. Okay, we're here to talk about my book, Wisconsin Waters, the Ancient History of Lakes, Rivers, and Waterfalls, published by the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. And this book is in somewhat the same vein as my other book, Wisconsin State Parks, Extraordinary Stories of Geology and Natural History. And this book won a gold medal in the National Book Competition and was the bestseller for the press the year it came out. So they were kindly willing to take a chance on Wisconsin waters. And that book is kind of in the same vein with the geologic and natural history as the State Parks book was. It uses the state's waterways as entry points. Did everybody hear me okay? Anybody have a joke? Yes. Okay. So before we start on the book, I just want to take a minute to thank some people who made it possible for us to be here tonight. April and the Denver Library folks, and Colette, and again Paul, who helped us get things running here. What a great venue. Never done this before. And also, very special thanks to my wife, Gail, who's here, sitting in the second row there, center. She's my partner in this effort, as in everything we do, and especially in helping me with ideas, research, photos, coaching, managing. She's kind of the boss, so thank you. So I've been fascinated by Wisconsin's natural settings, its forests and fields and waters, since I was about 5, when my older brother John took me on my first of many hikes in the woods and fields around our hometown of Cumberland, Wisconsin, the northwest corner there. And later we moved to Hayward, where I went to high school. And there my brother got me out canoeing. This is our first canoe trip on the Anaconda River. It dates us, obviously. It was taken before there was color photography, so let alone the internet and everything else. But I quickly fell in love with the Anaconda River. I probably dedicated this book to my brother John, who's in the back. So regarding Wisconsin waterways, there's plenty to talk about. Water is so important to all of us here in Wisconsin. And as I summarize in the following passage from my book's preface, why it's so important. So this is from the preface. Tucked into the corner of the upper Midwest, formed by two of the Great Lakes, and bordered on its west side by North America's largest river, Wisconsin is framed by waterways and rich in various water features. Within its borders lie 15,000 lakes, most of them formed by the glaciers some 10,000 years ago. The state is laced with more than 12,600 rivers and streams that trickle or surge over dozens of waterfalls that mesmerize so many visitors every year. Wisconsin's economy depends largely on its waters, and water has done much to shape the history of the state. So each of Wisconsin's waterways has a story to tell, and together these stories weave a complex tapestry woven together in time and space by the flow of Wisconsin's waters. The first chapter of my book is the big picture kind of chapter. It addresses questions like where did water come from, how is it distributed on the planet, and how much of a total global amount of water is available to us all. And that last piece, the total available water, is what I find to be an incredible eye-opener. This graphic shows why. Now, in the upper circle here, that's all the water on the planet, but 97.5% of it is in the oceans. And too salty to drink, obviously. This sliver of water, of the Earth's total water, 2.5%, is fresh water. But most of that, is tied up in ice caps and mountain glaciers, where it's too deep underground to tap. So this graphic says that 1% of all the fresh water is easily accessible surface fresh water. Actually, I have read estimates from a lot of different sources that make it much less than that. A fraction of 1% of all the Earth's water is available to us as fresh water for all the planet's animals and plants and aquatic systems and all of the 8 billion people who now live on the planet. And just a small fraction of that amount flows in all the streams, rivers, lakes, and wetlands and aquifers of Wisconsin. So my hope is that with an awareness of this finite amount of water available to us, and it is finite, nobody's making any more of it, we'll be motivated to take good care of our waters, especially in wilder areas where so many plants and animals and people depend on good, clean water. Another one of the big picture kind of topics that I cover in my first chapter is the immense time frame for the geologic and natural history of our region. You see how this graphic starts way down at the bottom here with the formation of the Earth more than 4 billion years ago. And it winds its way up through all those distant eons in time into the Precambrian period, which is the period before complex living organisms began to evolve on the planet, through the Cambrian period here, where life began to evolve rapidly and become more diverse. About 545 million years ago is when the Cambrian period began. And somewhere in this last, and then it continues on across the spiral through the age of the dinosaurs and so on, somewhere in this last period here, the Quaternary period, about 200,000 years ago is when the modern version of humans emerged. And just within the last half of this last segment here, the Holocene epoch, is when that contains all of the written history of all of human history. So just that quarter inch or so, what looks like a quarter inch, represents all of written human history. And chapter 1 of my book goes back billions of years, as in this graphic, to describe the forces and processes that shaped our state's landscapes and waterways. The continental collisions, the volcanic eruptions, invasions by ancient seas, and massive glaciers. And the next 4 chapters in my book cover 4 regions of the state, roughly sketched out here. And the book is designed such that you don't have to read those 4 sections, those 4 chapters in any particular order. I just recommend that unless you're really well versed on geology and natural history, that you get an introduction to it or a refresher on it by reading chapter 1. It'll help you fully grasp the stories within each of the regional chapters. And each regional chapter begins with a map, like this one, showing the sites to be visited, and introducing, followed by an introduction, giving more background on that part of the state. And this is followed by, in each chapter, 4 to 6 sections, each of which covers a waterway. So chapter 2, for example, covers the Northern Highlands, and that includes the iconic lakes that we're also familiar with in this part of the state, along with 4 key rivers, including the Brule River, where I've done a lot of canoeing. That photo was taken by Gail at the Brule, and the Upper Wisconsin River, and the Lake Superior Shore, which I'll talk more about in a bit here. Chapter 3 is the northeastern part of the state, the northeastern ridges and lowlands. Explores some enticing waterfalls, like this one in Menominee County, as well as the Bay of Green Bay, some more important rivers, and the the upper Lake Michigan shore, the northern Lake Michigan shore, which includes Door County with its famous sites, such as this one, Peninsula State Park. Next is Chapter 4, the southeast border of the state. Southeastern Glacial Showcase, I call it. Covers the lower Lake Michigan shore with its beautiful dunes and other features. Lake Winnebago, the Horicon Marsh, which I'll also talk a little bit more about as we go here. And the Yahara Lakes around Madison. This slide shows a place called Big Springs, which feeds Lake Wingram, Madison, at the UW Harbor. And finally, Chapter 5 covers the driftless area of the southwest quarter of the state, with its mysterious ancient rivers, the Kickapoo shown here. You see the canoeists there? That picture there. Picture taken by Gail on a hike up through there. Devil's Lake. This chapter covers Devil's Lake, the lower Wisconsin River, and of course the vast valley of the Mississippi River at the southwest border of the state. So let's delve a little deeper into a couple of specific stories here. We'll just start with the favorite destination for many people, the shore of Lake Superior. As in each of my sites, I tell the deep story of how the area was formed, and then I follow that story with a travel guide, which shows how you can go to see some of the evidence of the history close up. Well, the story of Lake Superior, dates back to an event called the Mid-Continent Rift, in which a great crevice formed across a part of the ancient continent of North America about 1.1 billion years ago. A giant plume of magma, or hot fluid rock, had welled up from deep in the mantle of the earth and worked its way up into crevices and cracks and pried those open over a period of probably 25 million years. And check this image. None of the Great Lakes were here, of course. These are shown for reference only. They weren't there a billion years ago. But the rift is thought to have gone from the Kansas area all the way up through the arcing around through what would become the Lake Superior Basin, and then down into lower Michigan and probably beyond. This rift spewed untold tons of lava across this area that is tinted kind of brown, reddish brown color here. The lava that eventually created a rock called basalt, dense, dark-colored rock. And it amounted to many thousands of feet thick in some areas after 25 million years of these layers building up. It now makes up the bedrock or the foundation rock of most of these areas, including much of northwestern Wisconsin. And in that central rift zone, the land slowly subsided or sank due to the steadily increasing mass of basalt and other types of rock. This subsidence created a huge trough-shaped depression called a syncline, and it is lying across the area now occupied by Lake Superior. Don't worry about all the details in this drawing diagram. There's a lot of geologic jargon there. What matters is that all those rock layers cause the earth to sink into the pliable mantle rock underneath the crust and create this big trough. This is syncline. And as time went by, other types of rock, especially sandstone and shale, became part of the layering of rock in the Lake Superior syncline. And here's an example of one such type of rock, this one, the distinctive Lake Superior sandstone, shown here at Big Bay State Park on Madeline Island. And this type of rock famously lines the Bayfield Peninsula and the Apostle Islands. It's stained reddish brown due to the presence of iron in that rock. Another development was the creation of the Wisconsin Dome this green tinted area that covers north central Wisconsin, which includes this area, of course. This whole area was just slightly raised up, close to 1 billion years ago. And it was by geologic forces that were related to this rifting and the subsidence of land north of it. Just gently lifted up into a dome, just enough to make the land slope gently away from the center in all directions. And it's important because it determines the flow of the rivers up here. They tend to flow off the center into the west or south or east. And at some point in the distant past, probably 500 million to 1 billion years ago, the primitive North American continent collided with a smaller primitive continent as the North American continent was being formed by tectonics at its southeastern edge. And it was far from this rift zone, but the collision compressed the crust enough to heave up blocks of land called fault blocks. And one such fault block that was thrust upward was raised up just south of and parallel to the Lake Superior shore. And it's called the Douglas Fault. And it created cliffs like this one at Passing State Park near Superior, where the Black River crashes over the fault at Big Manitou Falls. This is the highest waterfall in the state. The Douglas Fault is not one big, long, continuous cliff like this, but it does crop up in several places along that line parallel to Lake Superior shore. Another river that flows over it is the Anaconda River. Several streams flow over the fault and create beautiful waterfalls. This one is at Anaconda Falls State Park, not far from Addison State Park. And the chapter goes on to describe how the Apostle Islands and Chequamegon Bay were formed. Here are the Apostles, this group of islands at the tip of the Bayfield Peninsula. Here's Chequamegon Bay. Beautiful bay in Lake Superior. And my book explains how plant and animal communities developed in the area after the glacier retreated for the last time, around 9,500 years ago. And I also discuss how early human communities lived along the shore, the archaic and woodland peoples in the copper culture lived up there. And more recently, the Ojibwe, who had expanded across much of northern Wisconsin when European settlers first arrived European explorers first arrived in the 1700s. But by 1854, the U.S. government had reduced the Ojibwe lands to those light yellow or white spots that dot this map. 8 reservations, 3 of them on the lake shore. Just a small fraction of the shoreland that their ancestors had occupied for thousands of years. At the end of the Lake Superior Shore section in the chapter is a travel guide, as I said. And in this case, I traced a travel route along the shore on highways that give you the best access to the sites that I discuss in the chapter. And I'll read a sample of the travel guide, so you get a sense of how you can use it. Highway 13 descends into the valley of the Siskiwit River, where Wisconsin's northernmost town, Eucopia, overlooks Siskiwit Bay. This shallow and well-protected bay is popular among beachgoers and boaters, and the town serves as a port for commercial fishing vessels. Just west of town is the Lost Creek Bog State Natural Area, a sensitive and increasingly rare lakeshore ecosystem where rising lake levels have put the mouths of 3 creeks underwater. And these 3 creeks descend from the hills to the south. One of them forms a gorgeous, secluded waterfall called Lost Creek Falls. A side trip there involves a 1.5-mile hike. I highly recommend it. Excuse me, and then the travel guide goes on to explain how you find the trailhead, and then it continues after the description of Lost Great Falls. Out of Cornucopia, Highway 13 passes the west end of the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, famous for its intricately carved caves, pillars, and arches in colorful Lake Superior sandstone. Some of this stretch displays stunning flows of ice during winter, making the Bayfield Peninsula ice caves a world-renowned destination for hardy winter hikers and kayakers. And this photo was taken by a crazy friend of mine who actually likes to go kayaking out there. Maybe some people, I don't know, do, but adventurers get out there. So there's much more in my book about this area, this whole area. But now let's leave the Lake Superior shore and travel southeast across the state to Anaconda Marsh, which appears in Chapter 4. This great marsh, one of the largest freshwater cattail marshes in the world, was generated by none other than the great writer and scientist Aldo Leopold in his classic The Sandstone Almanac. In a reading called Marshland Elegy, he wrote the following. A dawn wind stirs on the great marsh. With almost imperceptible slowness, it rolls a bank of fog across the wide morass. Like a white ghost of a glacier, the mists advance, riding over phalanxes of tamarack, sliding over bog meadows heavy with dew. A single silence hangs from horizon to horizon. Although Leopold was a good writer. Question about that. My Anaconda story begins with that quotation and is followed by the story of the marsh, beginning with how the basin for the marsh was scooped out by several glaciers, beginning as long as 2.5 million years ago. And most of that carving was done by the most recent glacier, the one named after Wisconsin, and it created this huge basin which lies mostly in Dodge County, 13 miles long, 4 miles wide, and it was filled with water melting off the glacier to become what's called a glacial lake, which is a pool of icy meltwater forming after a glacier. Back then, the area was a tundra that might have resembled this artist's rendition. It would have hosted only the hardiest of ground cover species, lichens, mosses, some grasses, eventually stunted tree species. And the animals in the area included woolly mammoths, shown here, musk oxen, mastodons, caribou, and probably large cats, which you can see down in the corner here of this image. And it may also have included these incredibly interesting animals called giant beavers, which I didn't know about until I started researching this story. Beavers as big as today's black bears or bigger. And other large mammals that have since gone extinct. And for many decades after the glacier had shaped the Anaconda Basin and was receding to the north, the area remained tundra, where the mammoths ranged across the plain munching grasses. Here's a picture of Gail getting to know the last remaining mammoth. It stands today like a sentinel overlooking the marsh. Big fellow, but he's pretty gentle. It's actually, that's a life-size replica of a mammoth. The mammoths went extinct about 11,000 years ago, but they may have watched as humans moved into the area around 1,000 years before that, 12,000, 13,000 years ago. Nearly every major historic native culture known in the upper Midwest is thought to have used the marsh, including the paleo hunters, some who were actually after the mammoths as well as other big mammals, and the archaic cultures and later the woodland native cultures, and the effigy mound builders. They were present in the Anaconda area between 700 and 1200 AD. One of the best surviving clusters of Indian mounds in the state can be viewed at Nitschke Mounds County Park near the southwest corner of the marsh, shown here. The word Horicon is derived from an Algonquin term meaning land of clean, pure water. And archaeologists have found evidence of a network of trails around the marsh used for centuries by various native peoples, some of them intersecting at the south end at a ceremonial grounds that's now occupied by the city of Oregon. Now, the Marsh story, the Oregon Marsh story ends well at this point in time. This is what it looks like today. But beginning around 1800, the marsh went through a tortured period. It was first flooded to facilitate logging. That was followed by overhunting to the point where duck and other waterfowl species were nearly wiped out. Later, people drained the marsh to try to farm it. Did not work out. Here's a picture of a plowed area in one of those failed attempts to farm the marsh. The plowing caused the marsh to dry out, and then those deep peat deposits under the marsh caught fire. And they burned for years until most of the peat deposits had largely turned to mud. So it was a mess. But then in 1921, concerned citizens began a long process of restoration and protection of the marsh. And today it's completely protected. You can see here the northern part of is a national wildlife refuge. The southern third or so is a state wildlife area. And the marsh is even recognized by the United Nations as a wetland of international importance. You can walk through the marsh on boardwalks and earthen dikes to get close-up views of the many flowering plant species. This is a photo that Gail took of a milkweed flower with cattails behind it. The marsh hosts countless species of insects, including the endangered monarch butterfly, which depends on this milkweed. And you'll see amphibians and reptiles, and of course, birds. Hundreds of species of birds use the marsh, especially during migration times, which is right now. This photo and the first one you saw of the marsh at dawn were taken by Jack Bartlemine of the Friends of Oregon Marsh. And we owe those folks a great deal of gratitude for their ongoing work to restore and protect the marsh. In fact, thanks to any of you here tonight who are members of any Friends of group related to a park or other natural area of the state, you do great work. And as with all my stories, I end with, I follow the story with a travel guide. Basically, in this case, a driving route around the marsh on county and state highways. But you can also bike them if you want. Lots of people do. And you'll want to start your trip with a visit to the Oregon Marsh Education and Visitors Center, run by the Friends of Oregon Marsh. It's an impressive collection of fascinating artifacts and information. And from the Visitor Center, you can take hikes all over the marsh on miles of trails. To finish the Oregon Marsh story, here's a reading from my book that takes us back to Aldo Leopold. In 1948, Leopold expressed some pessimism about the restoration of Oregon Marsh. Observing the brutal and widespread disturbances to the marsh, he feared that someday quote, the last crane will trumpet his farewell and spiral skyward from the great marsh, unquote. No doubt Leopold would be pleased to see that his pessimism was unwarranted in the long run. The marsh has survived those disturbances to become a thriving marshland ecosystem. And indeed, the Oregon value, protect, and preserve an area that they care about. It's a wonderful story. So that's how my book works. Wherever I go, I also like to talk a little bit about the local geology, and it's fun to research local geology and talk about it. And here in Three Lakes, you have an interesting story too. I guess you know this is the town down here, and all these great lakes all around. Most of Wisconsin's lakes are kettle lakes, including almost all that you see here. And that means that they were formed by great chunks of ice that had calved off the glacier like icebergs as it retreated to the north. And these masses of ice sat for centuries being covered by the sand and gravel and other debris that flowed away from the glacier in sheets and streams of melt water. And then when the ice finally melted out, it left depressions called kettles, most of which were filled with water to form these kettle lakes. And I explain this in much more detail in my chapter 2 in the section called Lake Country. Another example of a nearby waterway that I covered is the Wisconsin River, flowing just a few miles to the west of here. So let's talk about that a little bit. This is how I introduced the Wisconsin River in my book. A geographer's description of the Wisconsin River might make it seem like a docile giant, a 430-mile stream that rises in Wisconsin's deep north woods, meanders southward across the state, most of the state's length. Across most of the state's length, then swings westward to flow across the ancient driftless area, emptying quietly into the Mississippi River. It drops just 1,067 feet, or 2.5 feet per mile on average, between its source and its mouth. The river may indeed be docile, but the long, wide Wisconsin River Valley belies a history of upheaval, including continental collisions, a great rift in the planet's crust, crushing glaciers, and catastrophic floods. Now, the upper Wisconsin River that you're so familiar with and the lower Wisconsin River downstream of Portage, Wisconsin, are really two very different rivers, literally two different rivers that got joined in time. And they have greatly different stories. Here we'll just focus on the upper Wisconsin, which was shaped by major geologic events. For example, not far from where this photo was taken near Stevens Point, there are rock exposures in some of the river's rapids that reveal the base remnants of a major ancient mountain range called the Pedunkian Mountains. They were uplifted around 1.8 billion years ago across northern Wisconsin and neighboring states by a collision of two primitive continents. Another example of how geology shaped the valley is the overall shape of the land that sends the river southward due to the creation of the Wisconsin Dome that I mentioned around a billion years ago. After the Mid-Continent Rift period. And of course, the biggest player in the shaping of the Wisconsin Valley were the glaciers, the most recent of which is shown here. Ice masses advanced from the north carrying incredibly huge amounts of silt, sand, gravel, and boulders, and dropping it all across the land as it melted away. Now, throughout the Wisconsin River Valley, this glacial debris, or glacial till as it's called, averages 100 feet deep and gets as deep as 240 feet. So the valley of the upper Wisconsin River is set into a glacially formed landscape. In the most recent glaciation, the Wisconsin Valley lobe advanced south out of the Lake Superior Basin into the northernmost part of the Wisconsin River Valley, carving it wider and deeper as other glaciers had done. Now, all along the front edge, the front edge of the glacier, where it actually stopped advancing, when it began to melt back, it left a long, broad zone of this till that I talked about sometimes in the form of very high, called moraines. And some of you may know about the Ice Age Trail that's being built to follow those moraines and this line here, all the way across the state. I believe it's 1,200 miles. And that glacier might have looked something like this, present-day glacier in Greenland, as it inched its way across the state. Beginning about 18,000 years ago, it began to melt, and it retreated. And as it retreated, massive flows of meltwater moved this glacial debris around in the river valley. Glaciologists have described the ancient upper Wisconsin as a broad stream of meltwater flowing between great walls of ice for centuries before it all melted away. Now this part of the river between Merrill and Stevens Point, stretch right here, will interest you because it is the oldest segment of the upper Wisconsin River Valley. This white line, as you know, shows as I just said, shows the furthest advance of the glacier in those moraines. And in this zone below the white line, defined by this width here, this zone between this line and the white line, there's plenty of evidence that the land was glaciated much earlier, probably hundreds of thousands of years ago. And that was when this part of the river valley was carved. Now another piece of evidence in this regard, as you probably noted, there are far fewer lakes in this region south of Merrill here. Look, there's hardly any natural lakes that show up on this map, whereas up here in your neck of the woods, the lakes are so dense, so many lakes. This is because when the land sits undisturbed by glaciers for a long time, stream systems develop and gradually drain the land and all the lakes. So to the south, the stream systems have had hundreds of thousands of years since they were glaciated to develop, and most of the lakes have been drained by those streams. While the landscape up here is just only 10,000 years old or so. Now, I mentioned that the Wisconsin River is a largely docile river today. But, the steepest segment of the river, called Grandfather Falls, lies not that far from here, just north of Merrill. And there the river drops 90 feet in 1.5 miles. Gail took this picture during high water a few years ago when we were visiting the area. And you can see in this slide, the same vantage point taken in winter, that the river flows over huge polished boulders and exposures of Precambrian rock. Some of these boulders are 10 feet or more in diameter. And they're more than 500 million years old, Precambrian. Some of the oldest rocks in the state. Not the oldest, but some of the oldest. So, looking at this slide again, you can see the Grandfather Falls can be a roaring cascade of rapids. Anything but docile. Well, that's part of the story of the upper Wisconsin River Valley. I have much more in the book on the upper and lower Wisconsin River Valley. And it's been a pleasure for me to be here on this great venue. Welcome any questions that you might have about what I've talked about here or anything else. And if you want, I can sign copies of the book for you too when we're done with the questions.
Could you comment on the Fox River, which I believe is the only north-flowing river in North America, if not the world?
Yeah, it flows. It starts out flowing in every which way because it's on such a low, flat land.
Right.
The upper Fox winds all over the place, and then when it gets to Lake Beaumont and those lakes, then it turns and flows north, and that's just because of the lay of the land. It was that whole area was covered by a glacial lake called Glacial Lake Oshkosh, and the Fox River Valley and
And the Fox is an interesting river. It doesn't really pick up any speed until it gets north of Lake Winnebago, flows through Lake Winnebago, and then flows kind of rapidly down, more straight line down to Green Bay, which on the map it's up to Green Bay, and on the land it's down to Green Bay.
Yeah, I went to school in Fort Norbert on the Fox. So.
Oh yeah. Good place to go. I love the Fox City. And I answer your question. Okay. Yes?
You know, many people don't realize that our east of here we have the sixth largest waterfall in the state, Breakwater Falls. And people don't realize that because in 1920, in the 20s, the power company that was there decided to stop the falls, divert the water for power purposes, and they built a dam.
Yeah.
And when it was up for relicensing about 2 years ago, a person in the area did a lot of historical, checking up on this because he could see that there was a trail that this diverted water had been in.
Oh.
Well, with the relicensing deal that was made with with We Energies, they had to now let water come down the old trail.
Oh.
And so how much water do they need?
Well, the minimum is 29 CFS, which is a fiddly amount.
Yeah.
But the Pine River does flood in the spring. And anything over 674 CFS has to be routed through the original river channel. And the odd thing about Breakwater Falls is that it did not appear on the maps for over 90 years.
Oh.
Because there was no water running to it. And that's just in the last 4 years, I'd say, there's been a movement to get Breakwater Falls renamed. And there's 3 drops, and it's the 6th largest. The other 5 largest waterfalls in the state are in the northwest side of the state, and this is in the the northeast side of the state. About an hour east of here, just in Florence County.
Breakwater, you said?
It's called Breakwater Falls.
I have not been there.
It's on the Pine River.
The Pine.
Right,
And aren't there some waterfalls in Marinette County that are part of the Pine River as well?
No, that would be the Pike River.
Oh yeah, I forget it. Yeah, I'm familiar with the Marinette County waterfalls. I covered another one called Wisconsin Rocks, but that's great to know. Thank you.
And if you were to go to exploreflorencecounty.com, on that website, underneath the area where I mentioned videos, you can see a video that was made by the person that really was the instigator in reforming the falls, you might say, that he made probably about 2 years ago. John made it, and so if you want to see the falls, it's online.
It's an 8-minute video, very well done.
It's another restoration story. I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you. I wish I'd known about that. It was so hard to pick and choose the sites for a book like this. I only can have 19 because there's just not room in the book, and it can only be so thick. It's got a budget like everything else.
Also, Breakwater Falls runs over some of the oldest rock in the state.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, some of that rock that was formed by that collision that created the Pinokian Mountains, which some people think is the same size and shape of, say, the High Sierras. But they, of course, eroded away a long time ago. Well, thank you for that. Breakwater Falls.
Explore Florence County.
Explore Florence County. Explore Florence County. Check it out. Thank you. Anybody else have any questions? Comments? Well, thanks. Thanks so much.
We just want to thank Scott one more time for coming, maybe coming all this way. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you to the Center for the Arts for having us. His book is for sale up here. I was debating whether or not to tell people not to buy your book or to buy your book because you totally outed my favorite falls, which is Lost River Falls. So I was like, do I buy them all or do I share it with everybody? And I'm encouraging you to find that falls, buy his book. It's a great little falls, and it's a great little hike, and honestly, it's one of our favorites. So have a great night, guys. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, everyone.